Welcome to this, our second talk on the restoration of the organ. I'd also like to welcome all those who are joining us online. I know we have visitors from, in fact, across the world who are interested to see our talk tonight. It's taken 3 years, probably a little bit more than that, to restore the organ, and those of you who stayed for Evensong will have heard the magnificence of its playing, and tonight we're going to be hearing some more of it. And we're also delighted to welcome tonight two of the people who've been instrumental in the restoration of this great instrument. First of all, I want to introduce Andrew Scott, who is head voicer for Harrison & Harrison. Their expertise in both taking the organ out, moving it up to Durham, repairing it, bringing it back and making it sound so magnificent has been remarkable, even through the difficulties of the crisis we've experienced. And so we're incredibly grateful to them. And Andrew is here tonight to talk a little bit about how they've done that and to answer some questions if you have any questions towards the end. I'd also like to introduce Robert Woodland, who is, I was going to say, a world-famous expert grainer, gilder, painter, member of many guilds. His work is not only on our organ, but also in the houses of royalty and some of our heroes, including, I understand, the captain of the England football team tonight. I hope he's more interested in playing football than he's gilding. And then obviously we'll hear tonight from our home team, from Robert Sharpe, our Director of Music, who not only looks after the organ and the choir, but has also been instrumental in the concept of the restoration and in the management of the project. As you can imagine, it's quite a significant project. And also from, as I would almost like to say, behind the curtains, if we hadn't got rid of the curtains as part of the restoration, Ben Morris, our Assistant Director of Music, who will be playing from the console. That's enough of me. All remains for me is the safety instructions. So I must remind you, please do check that your phone is off and that your mask is on. Sadly, those are the restrictions we live within. We're not expecting an evacuation this evening. In the event of a fire or any other reason to evacuate, there will be an announcement from this lectern. And at the end, we will have a period of time for questions, but then please do leave carefully and safely in a COVID-safe manner. For those of us who want to watch the football, please do not get in my way. So now I'm going to hand over to Robert, who will take us through the evening.
I don't know if my microphone is on. Yes, it is. Yeah, thank you. It's very nice to see so many of you here again for this second event, following the one where we launched the book by Nicholas Thistlethwaite about 3 weeks ago. We have 3 pieces of organ music in tonight's event, as well as some improvised demonstrations. And so to start the proceedings now, Ben's going to play the Spitfire Prelude by William Walton in an arrangement for the organ. that was a good opportunity to hear the reed stops of the organ, and most notably, perhaps at the end there, the tuba mirabilis, which you can hear speaking straight down into the nave. The rest of the organ now comes up to match that rather more than it did before. I'm just going to give a very quick history of the organ in this present position before inviting Andy to talk a little bit about the recent work. So the organ that you can see here on the screen was placed there in the early 1830s after the fire of 1829, which completely burnt the previous instrument and also the roof of the choir area of the cathedral to the east. This fire was lit deliberately by an arsonist who didn't like the buzzing sound of the organ. You can probably only spend a moment thinking how he would react if he was to hear what we've done now, and possibly he would try and blow up the cathedral. The instrument then originally was built by Elliott and Hill, started in about 1832, and it contained the first 32-foot metal pipes to be made in an English organ. And these still stand in the south choir aisle, on this side of the organ, proudly in position from dating from the 1830s, where they've been ever since. And in order to make these huge pipes, Hill had to devise a machine which could roll zinc into cylinders and then join them together. And you can see, if you look at these pipes, the cylinders are plainly visible underneath the painted finish of the pipes. They're not planed down in any way. A few years later, Hill had another opportunity to make a stop of this kind at Birmingham Town Hall. And in that organ, he placed these large 32-foot pipes in the front of the case on full view. And so in that case, he actually planed down the joins of the pipes so they look like whole pipes, and painted the fronts. But if you go around the back, they look exactly the same as the York ones, with the soldered seams visible behind. And it's extraordinary to think of the confidence of these Victorian builders in England at the time, with no existing stops of that kind in the country to model his work on, and no easy means of travelling abroad to see the European examples, which there definitely were by that time. So Hill just went and did it, as so many Victorians did. I'm using the word Victorian in a slightly loose way because, of course, you will know that 1832 was still within the reign of William IV, but we tend to forget his rather brief time on the throne. The first organ was continually being enlarged, extra tops added, to try and make a bigger effect in the building. And this culminated with the instrument being so large that it was barely possible to play it, because it had a mechanical key action. That means there was no means of assisting the player in the touch, because that hadn't yet been invented. So it's known that Camage, who was the organist and the designer of this instrument, sometimes had to stop completely when playing a loud piece because of fatigue in his fingers. Only when 1859 came and John Naylor took over as organist did the instrument begin to take on a more modern style, though, of course, nowadays it's very different from what we would say as modern. Hill constructed a normal compass for that instrument. That means that the bottom notes of the keyboards were where you would expect them to be, rather than being a whole octave lower, which the Camage organ had been. And he also made an independent normal compass division for the pedals. So for the first time in 1859, the organ had a 4-manual console, 4 keyboards, of conventional compass with a normal bottom C up to a top G, and a pedal division, which was unusually complete, because Hill had been able to reuse pipes from the manuals which had been taken away from the bottom octave, which had been discarded in 1859. So he had a huge pool of pipes from which to draw, and made the most of that by providing a very complete pedal organ, which went from the 2 32-foot stops, retained from the earlier Elliott and Hill organ, right up to a 12th, 15th, and 5-rank mixture, and then 5 reeds, including a 32-foot sackbut, and right up to a clarion. So a very complete division. And this organ did faithful service through the remainder of the 19th century and was joined briefly in 1863 until 1903 by a second instrument which stood out here in the nave, I think in this bay here. That instrument was always controversial right from day one because it disfigured the nave in a visual way, in a style which not everyone appreciated. So it was the gift of the dean at the time. We haven't had a dean since who's given an organ, though one later on did pay for a stop on the organ in 1931. But that instrument remained until 1902, I think, when it was removed to a church in Manchester where it now stands. So then the organ had to be rebuilt again because it was ailing and the mechanisms were failing. And things went in a different direction in 1903 when the London firm of J.W. Walker and Son was engaged to come and rebuild the organ. And this was really a new organ, which is why we've described the current project as being a once-in-a-century project. Obviously, the organ's been worked on many times in the last century because cathedral organs are played so much, they need regular maintenance and overhauling. But it isn't since 1903 that the instrument was renewed mechanically. So Walker's provided brand new soundboards, the sections of the organ on which the pipes stand, and a new winding system, and a new tubular pneumatic action. And for the first time, the player was moved from his original position on the eastern side of the organ round to the south side of the organ, so this side with the console on the end. The idea being that from that position, he would be able to manage playing services both in the choir for the normal daily song services and also out here in the nave. And Walker's retained several stops from Hill's organ. I think it's about between 14 and 20, something like that. I can't remember the exact figure. But these were all revoiced, and in most cases they were rescaled as well, with an extra pipe or two being added in the middle of the stop to enable the pipe scale to be increased to give a fuller sound. And this was very much in line with the fashion of the day. The Edwardian style was a fuller, more romantic and orchestral sound than that of 1859, which had still had its roots in the English classical organ with big chorus work. Walker's organ then carried on and is still the core of this present instrument. And then in 1913, when Sir Edward Bairstow took over as organist and master of the music, he began to address some of the perceived shortfallings of the Walker organ when heard in this part of the church. And you can see behind me the vast central tower space, the lantern, which acts as a tonal divide between the screen and things going on in the choir and this enormous nave. And without special effects from the organ, special devices, a lot of the sound of a screen instrument gets sucked up into the tower space. And so it was felt very much that although the Walker organ of 1903, which is still the core of our present organ, was a very beautifully executed piece of work with lovely finishing and beautiful soft sounds, it didn't quite have the impact to overcome this tower space. So Bairstow set about with Arthur Harrison in 1917, a few years after taking up post, to enhance the great division of the organ a little bit by placing some of the stops on higher pressure than they'd previously been and increasing the scope of that high pressure work. And this enabled the sound of the great chorus to overcome the central tower space and come over into the nave. He also added the bigger great reeds, they converted from the earlier Hill reeds, what we now known as Harrison trombas. The trombas in York were always a rather more fiery style of tromba than Harrison produced in some of his organs. Each one of the Harrison trombas differs in style depending on the space it's in. And the York ones, in line with Bairstow's requirements, were very dramatic in their effect and were joined really as a help for leading large congregations by the famous tuba mirabilis, which you've just heard at the end of the Walton prelude. And this was, at the time, one of the very largest tuba stops in the world, and Bairstow caused an actual trumpet player with his instrument to climb up inside the organ and sound the instrument from different stages inside the case in order to ascertain which the best place would be for the new pipes to be positioned. You can't really imagine that happening with today's health and safety requirements and the risk assessments that will be needed. And the place settled on was just above the parapet. So as you're looking at the organ now behind me, if you look at the front pipes, which you can see in front of you, immediately beneath those, the tuba pipes are just hidden on top of the stone parapet with their resonators facing down into the nave. So by that extraordinary means, the sound of this stop was able to fire across the central tower space and be heard clearly in the nave. Harrison's work was completed in 1931 after an installation of new heating in the Minster caused the mechanism to fail almost completely in the late 1920s. And money was quickly raised in America, as well as in England, to enable a reconstruction of the action with a new electro-pneumatic system. So Harrison electrified the Walker primaries to make a more modern system, and also provided a new console at that time, and further completed the work done in 1917 by adding the pedal-off-glide stop, and the great trombers were further increased in pressure to complete what was then probably the sort of zenith of the York organ in its most romantic and vigorous form. And this organ did faithful service right through until the 1960s, when styles had changed somewhat. We'll talk about that in a little while, but I'm going to hand over to Andy Scott now. Andy, it's great to have you here, who has been responsible for the recent resetting of the tonal scheme to the 1931 aesthetic. Rather, it's not exactly the copy of that, but it's all within that style. And Andy will talk to you a little bit about some of the challenges he faced there and some of the things that were reinstated which had been taken away in 1960 and the logic behind some of those things. So Andy, if you'd like to fill us in on that, thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Good evening, everyone, and those of you watching online. It's a great privilege to be here, and there are not many cathedral organists that know their instrument as well as Robert does here, and his vision and championing of this project are unparalleled, really, and it's marvelous to work with him, so thank you, Robert. For those of you who don't know much about Harrison and Harrison, here's a little introduction as to who we are. We were founded in 1861, and this is our 160th year. We rebuild and restore organs worldwide, and obviously at the moment with COVID, that's rather curtailed that. We are the largest firm in England, employing over 40 people, and we have a nationwide tuning round where we have 9 tuners positioned around the country carrying out all of our tuning and maintenance. And apart from York Minster, other notable instruments that we've been responsible for are those in Westminster Abbey, King's College, Cambridge, the Royal Festival Hall, and Canterbury Cathedral most recently. Rebuild or restoration is a question that comes up a lot on a project like this. And in the true sense of the word, this organ is a rebuild, although there are huge elements of it being a restoration as well. Inside the case, the organ is entirely brand new mechanically, in terms of the soundboards and the wind system, and there are a lot of new pipes in there, which we'll come to a bit later. But there are also an incredible amount of old pipes from the hill organ and the various different incarnations. So the marrying up the rebuild versus restoration is a really difficult one. So I would say this instrument is both a rebuild and a restoration. The 1834 case pipes are perhaps the most important part of the restoration in this instrument. In the 1903 organ, they were taken out of use. When Walker built their organ, they put their pipes inside. They possibly didn't want to use the scaling that was in the pipes that are in the case that you can see. But at the same time, those pipes are made of a very soft material, and they were made and voiced to do a very different job in 1830s. So when Walker rebuilt their organ, they added inside of the case all of the pipes you can see crammed in, which hemmed the sound inside of the case, but made the pipes tantalizingly silent. The restoration saw all of these case pipes come back to the workshop in Durham when we had to unpick what to do with them. And at one point we were worried that we weren't going to be able to preserve them because they are very old, they're very fragile. You imagine standing on one leg for your entire life. The fatigue had kind of set in and they were all sagging. And there was even one pipe in the southeastern case which had bent inwards and was being held in place by the woodwork on the top of the organ, ready to fall out basically. So we got these pipes back to the workshop and we then had to scratch our heads as to what we were going to do with them. And our metal shop foreman and I did an assessment of these pipes. And the first thing to do was work out how we could stabilize them. So each of these pipes was taken in turn and we did a full assessment because of the historic value of these pipes. They're some of the oldest speaking case pipes in existence, and we needed to first and foremost preserve the heritage. But at the same time, we wanted to bring them back to speaking again so that we could release space inside the case for more parts of the organ and to let the sound of the organ speak out. So we chose the worst pipe of the east case. The east case pipes are very long over-length pipes, what we call architectural length. So the pipe is a lot longer than its actual musical speaking length. And what we did was we picked the worst one and decided we would work on that and see if we could restore that pipe to being structurally sound. And that indeed worked. And then the next conundrum was to make them speak again. So they came into the voicing room, that one pipe, and I set to on having to cut the mouth to the right proportion again and putting wind through those pipes. So in Durham, it was a rather magical day when a pipe that had been silent since 1903 spoke for the first time again. And you know, when we're restoring organs like this, we go on a journey. In Durham, we have a team of organ builders, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, but we go on a journey with every instrument. And we put part of ourselves into it, especially a project like this, which we as a company have all individually lived with for 3 years. So we got these pipes speaking again, and a decision was made that we would restore them. And you can read all about that in the book as well, if you haven't got a copy yet. Once the pipes had all been through the metal shop and been restored, we were very careful to preserve the stenciling, the diapering, the colouring and the decoration on the pipes. And of course, naturally in restoring the case pipes, we had to do things such as cut the foot off. If you look up at the organ case behind me, the foot is the tapered section of the pipe and the body is the cylindrical section. And to get an idea of the scale of these pipes, if you look over to the pulpit over there, you can see some lovely reusings of the original pipes as lovely flower planters, and there's a one underneath the screen as well. So you can get an idea of the scale of the pipes in the towers. The 4 corners of the organ have 3 pipes in there. They're the tower pipes. They were beyond economical repair. And of course, this restoration, these pipes have got to continue to stand there without falling out. So a decision was made to make those pipes new. And of course, they've been made to the same sizes as what was there before, but they were completely plain with no decoration on altogether. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we did the restoration of the organ and the timeline, but at this point, because we're talking about the case pipes, it's probably going to be a good time to bring Robert in. And I've known Robert for best part of 8 years or so. Yeah, and Robert and I first met each other very briefly when I called in at St George's Hanover Square one day, and he was putting the gold leaf on the case pipes of their new organ there. But we worked together, Harrison and Harrison, with Robert Woodland, and I think Deborah was involved as well, wasn't she?
Yes, yeah.
And this was the Freemasons Hall in Great Queen Street in London. And Robert, very expertly there, I'm sure he'll tell you a bit more. I think he told me it was something like 3 tennis courts of gold leaf he used on the cases there. Of course, the organs, it's like a sweet wrapped in a foil, and the whole organ's done in gold leaf. it's a rather spectacular affair. But Robert got involved here with the case pipes. So once we'd shipped them back to the Minster after restoration in Durham, we handed over to Robert and Deborah to work their magic. Voicing's rather a dark art, but I think what Robert does is a dark art too. And before I let him go, I'll just tell you another story about Great Queen Street when we did the Freemasons. We added another section of organ in the centre there, and there was 2 wooden wind trunks going up either side of a marble wall, and we boxed them all in. And Robert came along, and while we were voicing, he spent days layering up the different levels of paint using feathers and paint brushes and all sorts to marble the woodwork of these 2 wind trunks. And you can go and stand right in front of these wind trunks, and you can't tell what is the marble and what is the wood until you actually put your hand on it and the marble's cold and the wood isn't, or if you knock on the wall. And what Robert does is nothing short of a miracle, but he'll tell us a bit more about what he's had to deal with here.
Thank you. Well, as you know, I'm Robert Woodland, and I started my life off as a house painter and worked all my way through. There's various different parts involved in my job. And I got involved in organs about 16 years ago, where we'd done St James Garlic House in London, which is my livery company church. And that was for John Manders and company at the time. And from then on, we worked at many other churches all around London, St Peter's, St Stephen's, Rochester Row. Well, there's lots of others, but however, let's get back to this one here. Deborah, my partner who lives in America, unfortunately she can't be here due to the fact of this awful thing which is happening with us, all this COVID thing. Now, I was asked by Ian Bell, who was a consultant at the time, if I would like to come along and meet Robert, Mr. Robert Sharpe, and have a look at the organ to do the decorations as and when the organ was going to be rebuilt. And obviously, I think he took to me. I think he thought that I could knew what I was doing. But it was a very, very interesting job. Now, the reason why I'm saying that is obviously the decorations on the east and the west are the original ones which were done in 1859 by a gentleman by the name of Henry William Blackmore, which is in the book. If you haven't got it, buy it and you'll see. And I was just so fascinated with this work, being that the man, he actually done everything with his team in the case, whereas Deborah and I, we was able to lay them out on the bottom, redo all the designs, and hand cut all the stencils, and obviously as you see it now today. But in the meantime, while we're going along, and on the east side, the pipes there, they are all the original designs, the original colours. They've been literally restored and conservated. We haven't changed anything, only ones which, as Andy said, which were damaged. We've redone all of those, but everything is as the gentleman who did it. And the same on the east side, on the east and the west. We tried to, which we did, we kept everything, and we used oil colours. There's no acrylic paints. Everything was done the same way as what he carried it out, and with his team. And you can see exactly how it looks to this day, but it was a very, very interesting project. And obviously we had to come backwards and forwards while certain pipes weren't ready for us, and then go away and come back again. And I think, well, basically that's as far as I can say at the moment until I'm going to get any questions fired at me.
Thank you, Robert. So the case pipes were the significant part of the restoration. Meanwhile, in Durham, we were building the organ, and the timeline of this organ's kind of journey is a really long one. It's a very big organ. The Minster's a very busy building, and working with the Minster team here, we had to dovetail all sorts of different things together, such as scaffold and the protection of the King's screen, which you can see behind me. So the King's screen was all covered up in towards the end of 2017 or early 2018, I believe, in readiness for the organ builders to arrive on site. So we came in the spring of 2018 to measure the organ, and over the years we've worked on several projects where we've been asked to reduce the length of the duration without the organ in the building, so that the musicians can use a pipe organ in the building rather than an electronic substitute. So we've devised a method whereby we come and we measure the case and everything within it as best as we can, and all of the pipes. And we did that over several stages with the design team here and one of our voices. And all the pipes were lifted out and had their tips measured, their lengths measured, so that when we got back to Durham, we could actually begin drawing the organ whilst it was still in daily use here. Normally on a project like this, we would take the whole organ out and do all the measuring when it's in front of us on the bench, but so that we could keep the organ in use here and also reduce the duration. That scaffold was going to be up in the building and interrupting the building, so they couldn't have things like the Advent wreath, the large wonderful Advent wreath we have in front of the organ. To do that, we measured the whole organ before it even came out, and that was in the spring of 2018. And then in summer 2018, we began in the workshop building the various components, the soundboards, the reservoirs or the bellows, what you might know them as, all the leather work. And during that time was when the scaffold went up, and we came on site in autumn 2018 to take the organ out. That was a huge operation. Of course, the organ's all up a height. Everything has to be loaded into crates, and the crates have to first be lifted up onto the scaffold. They have to be filled, they have to be dropped. And then, of course, we've got to get them into a wagon and get them all back to Durham. It's all very big work. And then we had to turn the case pipes around, and they came back for Robert and Deborah to work on here in the Minster. So those of you who might have visited the Minster at that time were able to gaze upon them as they carried out their important work. Of course, an organ like this takes up a huge amount of space in a workshop. When an organ's together, it takes up less room than it does when it's in pieces. And we needed to free up the workshop to be able to build the organ up. And the first thing we did in Durham, down in the north choir aisle there, you'll see the ginormous wooden trombone pipes. We had all of that built up in the workshop, although we couldn't put the top sections on because we didn't have the height. But we needed to take that down, bring it back to site. And the team came and they installed the pipes in the north and south choir aisles. And that was to give the team a few weeks here doing that and get all the bits out of the workshop, and to try and reduce the site time, the need for our organ builders to be away from home was to do that first stage. Meanwhile, the organ's still being built in the workshop, quite a huge job. And throughout 2019 and early 20 was the entire organ. If you take the casework off the organ and imagine it unclothed, if you like, the organ was built up in the workshop exactly as it is standing here in the Minster. And Robert and many people from the Minster came and visited and saw it. And whenever we build an organ in the factory, there's always a gulp moment when the whole structure's up, and we look at it and we think, gosh, it's big. And that goes for every organ we build up in the factory. And we think, have we got the sums right? But of course, you put it here in the Minster, and everything in this vast space looks tiny. Even those big pipes up in the case behind me, they just look like pencils that you could just lift out. They're in fact 16 foot long, those pipes in the outer towers. It's extraordinary. So we finished building the organ up, took it all apart, and we brought it to site in spring, summer 2020. Now, of course, the world had changed rather dramatically by that point, and whilst our workshop remained open throughout the pandemic, our tuners were furloughed, but the work in the workshop continued, and our staff had to adapt to working socially distanced. And you know, can you imagine building an organ where you need to get 4 people around a heavy item, all socially distanced, trying to communicate and all of that kind of thing? But the Minster were fantastic in allowing that project to continue, and other projects as well. So we were able to work more or less to timetable, I think, in bringing the organ back. And then we came on site to do the voicing of the case pipes, because the scaffold was still all around the organ. We were able to voice those, and then the scaffold could come down. And I think the scaffold was up for about 2 years, was it, Robert? Which is a remarkable length of time. And all of that scaffold was done by the in-house team here at the Minster, and all working together with us, and all around the liturgies going on. A huge jigsaw puzzle to do all of that in the deliveries. And then in late 2020, we did the first section of voicing on the great organ. And then we had a rest through Advent and Christmas. And then we came back at the beginning of this year to undertake the rest of the voicing. And at rather unprecedented times, the voicing team often have to work late into the evening, while the organ builders, my colleagues, can work during the day doing the hard work, if you like. They've got to get the organ all built up and put together. And at Harrison's, we're a huge team. Everyone plays a different part in a well-oiled machine. I'm only the person who makes the organ sound good, but it's my colleagues who make the organ work good. And we all have a hand in this organ in one way or another. So about 30 organ builders, 25, 30 organ builders have all personally touched this instrument, although I'm the one sat here talking about it. It's a great team effort. So 3 years in total. I think it's time to hear the organ again, don't you, Robert?
I agree. Before we do the sort of total demonstration, and Andy and I have a conversation about the changes, Ben's going to play Sir Edward Bairstow's Scherzo. As I mentioned earlier, Bairstow was the organist from 1913 to 1946, 34 years. Francis Jackson, who succeeded him, who is now 103 years old, and is our third organist emeritus. I think that's probably unique at the moment, to be a cathedral with 3 living organists who are not currently in post. And Francis beat Bairstow by 2 years by serving for 36 years. So very unusually, the Minster organ bench was only occupied by 4 people over the course of the 20th century. And Bairstow was the person who had the first vision with Arthur Harrison for the style of work we've just recreated. So here's his Scherzo. We've come to the point where it's time to hear some of the different aspects of the organ's recent work. Andy's described some of them to you. So what we're going to do now is to hear some of the different sounds, and where there are significant reinstatements of things, I'm going to ask Andy to just talk a little bit about the challenges of making some of the stops, some of which haven't been made by Harrison & Harrison for 60 or 70 years. So and there's no one living who had voiced this kind of pipe before, these kind of pipes before. Robert, you talked a little bit about the decoration of the pipes, and I wondered if, before we just go on to the organ, whether you could say a little bit about the challenge of making the stencils, because the new pipes on the organ in the towers, which you can see, look exactly the same as the ones they replaced. And also the north and south pipes on the sides of the organ, which you're all speaking to, they are new, and they were also repainted, and the challenges of doing that.
Yeah, I'd first like to thank Deborah, my partner. She obviously done all the working out, all of the graphics and all the actual mathematical theories of them, with the aid of Robert helping as well with certain ways that they should be done. But the stencils themselves, everything there is hand cut. There is no machine, no laser beams. They were all cut. We use a certain paper, and then what we do is we cut them, and then they use what the polisher uses, the actual polish, the shellac. We coat them with it so that it makes all the edges lovely and smooth, and then obviously we use a very soft adhesive on the back, which it sticks to the pipe, and then it allows us to do the stenciling and lift it off without obviously affecting the paint and everything. And everything what you see there is done as it was originally done in the Victorian period. It's all oil paint, as I say, but where we use the stenciling, that paint has to be thicker, because if it's too thin it will run underneath the stencil, and obviously you won't get the crispness attached to it. And also all the gold leafing which was done there. You have to remember, in the Victorian period it was a lot thicker. It wasn't beaten out like it is today, but to make up for that, we use a double thickness gold leaf, which we're hoping will last as long as the Victorians from the 1859 period. But the actual setting out of the designs and everything which were done, it really is, it's a very interesting, but it's a very, very difficult job to do, because we have to get a line, what are called a snap line, right down the 16-foot pipe, and from the centre of the pipe we have to snap this line with chalk. So if you can imagine, it's snapped, taken away, and then you've got this line, and then the stencils are all individually worked out, the designs, then they're obviously put down and done individually, and then you see the actual designs which have arrived there now. And as I've previously said, all the colours, they were vermilion, and the beautiful greens and the blues, everything was matched, and they're all oil paints. We actually matched them all ourselves and done the conservation and restoring. And on the east side specifically, as I've previously said, we didn't change anything there from the fact of designs or anything. We was able to restore and conservate them and put them back without changing any of the designs which were there. The only ones we had to do, as Andy mentioned, was the pipes which were badly damaged. We had to match them all in, which wasn't easy, because on doing this, they hadn't been worked out the same way as my partner Deborah had done it mathematically. So we had to do each individual piece, and that created rather an interesting but a difficult thing. But I think the proof of the cooking is in the eating, and you can see the way it's turned out now, how it looks. And thank you, Robert.
I'm sure you'll agree that the facades do look fantastic now, and obviously it's evening light, but when you have sunlight on the organ, it now sparkles like a jewel box. in a way which it probably hasn't done since the 1850s, when it was first finished. Ben, I wonder if we can hear the bottom 6 notes of the great double open diapason, so you can hear the front pipes on this side speaking. You'll hear how they, because they're in the case, the sound really comes nicely into the space. It's almost like having a double bass player with his bow going across to energize the sound. The organ was lightened up in 1960 in the fashion of the time by under the auspices of Francis Jackson, very much in the style that other organs were being done. The heavier, bolder sounds of the 1930 Arthur Harrison effect were very much out of fashion in those days. And also, there were far fewer services in this part of the building, so the need for leading big hymn singing wasn't as frequent as it now is, or was, and hopefully will be again when we can sing. So this was a very successful piece of work done in 1960, and is made famous by the many recordings that Francis made in both the 60s and 70s, which are, I think it's fair to say, iconic in their status now, and document that wonderful instrument. And of course, when you record, you can put the microphones where you like to capture the sound of the organ in a way which isn't necessarily how it is in the space. And so what we've tried to do in this more recent work is to recreate the bolder sounds which we could hear from some old recordings from the 1950s of the organ before it was changed. And we could hear from those recordings how effective it was in the space. And Andy's mentioned the bringing the front pipes back into speech, which has meant that the big bass pipes which were taking their place inside the organ are no longer needed, giving much more space for the sound to come out. But also we've been able to incorporate some shutters on the west side of the swell box, rather than just the original ones on the south, which allowed the sound to be diffused in both directions, east and west. The new western ones enable the sound of the swell to come straight down into the nave, but without compromising its effect in the choir, where it remains the same as before. So I'm just going to ask Ben, as the first part of the demo, to play on the swell flutes very briefly without the west shutters engaged, and then with them engaged, so you can hear the difference between the two. And you can hear there how the sound suddenly comes into the room. And then I'm going to ask him to do the same with the full swell. That's the famous gritty sound on this style of organ. The York full swell is particularly well known from its use accompanying the choir in recordings over the years. So you hear it first without the shutters engaged, and then with the west shutters engaged, so you can hear the difference in this part of the building. So those shutters have given us an extra dimension to the 1930s work, where both the front pipes were not in use and also there were no west shutters. So this in some ways goes a stage further. So we're going to start on the great division now, and you can hear the open diapason stops. There are 4 of them now. In 1960 they were reduced to 3. So we'll hear the smallest, then the number 3, then the number 2. And then the new number 1 open diapason, which replaces the one which was moved to the pedals in 1960. And when we've heard that, I'll just ask Andy to talk a little bit about the challenges of voicing that stop. So here are the great diapasons in succession.
So what you heard there were the 4 diapasons on the grate, the largest one going last. And the first one's the number 4 diapason is a really what I would call an old English diapason. It's very sweet, very mellow, very charming to listen to, but it doesn't envelop the building. Then the number 3 diapason, it's slightly narrower in scale, but it's got more breadth, more colour about it. And then the second diapason's a bit broader still with a little bit more colour. And in a big building like this, you need the weight of the sound to get a hold of the building and get around the building and envelop every corner with sound. So this new number 1 diapason is a recreation of what's called a 5/8 scale diapason. And what that means is it's 5 notes bigger than the normal scale that we would use. And it's reserved for only the very largest and noblest of spaces like this. And what you hear when we play on that very big stop is the warmth and the breadth. It's like someone putting a big blanket around you, and it adds weight and gravitas to what sits above it. The employment of leather in this instance is really important as well. The upper lips of the pipe have got leather wrapped around, and that's there to thicken the lip up and to really it takes away all the harmonic interest, but gives the notes a lot of firm grounding in depth and in their fundamental tone rather than the upper partials of their harmonic series. So when you add it to the organ, it adds this huge blanket of colour, but without muddying things up.
Thank you. So Ben, if we can just continue on the grate, if you could take off the large diapason, but then add first the small 4-foot principal and then the octave. And then you'll hear then, if Ben then adds the number 1 diapason sound he's just been talking about to that sound after he's added the 2 4s, you'll hear how that brings the whole sound into the space by enveloping it in a way which is very effective in this size of space. When the big diapason came on at the end, the other stops almost sounded like they were louder as well, because it sort of amplifies the whole effect. So if we just carry on from there, Ben, and add the successively the octave, quint and 2-foot, and then the harmonics, and then the 3-rack mixture, and finally the 5-rack mixture, so you can hear the full great flue work. There are 5 reed stops, and we have an original 16-foot and 8-foot per sound stops, to which Harrison & Harrison have added a new clarion to complete that family. And then we've recreated the trombas 8 and 4, which were reduced in power and style in 1960, back to their original 1931. Well, they're not quite their original, their second incarnation. And when we've heard those in a moment, I'll ask Andy to talk a little bit about how he went about making these tromba stops. So first of all, we'll just hear the 8-foot per sound, and then add the 16, and then the clarion, and then maybe we can have separately the tromba and then the octatromba with it. trombas have a dual function on the organ. You can play them from both the parent manual, the great manual, but you can also transfer them to either the choir manual, the lowest keyboard, or to the solo. And so in normal use in the choir space of the Minster, they act as solo reeds, like what you might describe as normal tubas, in comparison to the famous tuba mirabilis. But then when the building is in more full use out here, they can be added as super chorus reeds on top of the rest of the grate to create an unparalleled great division. And then, of course, the mirabilis comes in over the top of that. So maybe then you could just play as a few chords on the trombas and then compare that to the mirabilis in chords as well, or single notes and odd chords. Leads up to the big tuba rather than the famous big tuba standing in a different world from the rest of the organ, which was the case somewhat in the past. So Andy, when you made the trombas for the first time here, how did you go about deciding what to do with them?
That's a really interesting question. Arthur Harrison, or Mr. Arthur as we affectionately know him in Durham, he often put trombas in his organs, and as Robert said earlier, they were very different depending on the organ. And the trombas here were always known as being very brilliant trombas, more like bright tuba stops. And the pipes here, when Arthur did the work back in 1917, he used the great reeds as they were and added to them his pipes. And Arthur was an amazing person at taking already extant material and turning it into his organ. So things like Westminster Abbey and King's College, Cambridge used an enormous amount of pipe work from the previous organ that was reworked as material in a new one. So the trombas here had gone through, they were turbocharged, if you like, in 1921, and then they were changed into being trumpets a bit later in their life. And we wanted to turn them back to being trombas. Thankfully, all the magic ingredients were still there. We still had the pipes, we still had what's called the shallots, which are the part that the tongue vibrates against, and that material to hand, we were putting the wind pressure back up to 15 inches. And the wind pressure dictates what thickness tongues we would use. And of course in Durham we're great hoarders. We've got 160 years worth of material and data, and we could look back over various different jobs to see what different tongue thicknesses we'd used over the years. And we picked a job that was known to have brighter version of the trombas, and we used that data to recreate the right tongue thicknesses. And here we are with the trombas, hopefully sounding like they did back in the day, shall we say. And in any project like this where we're recreating something in today's world, what we want to do is make it sound like it's always been there. And the end game for any voicer is to make sure that what we're doing sounds like it's always been there. And as Bob says, the proof of the pudding's in the eating. And if people come away from sitting at the organ not knowing which stops are new and which ones are old, I think that's a really successful job done.
Also on the organ, the pedal division was altered in 1960 with the biggest sounds taken away. In fact, the open wood stop, number 1 open wood, which gave the organ quite a big bass, is now in Ampleforth College, where it serves as a pedal sub-bass. And has lived happily there since the early 1960s. So we didn't feel we could ask for it back. But we have made a new number 1 open wood on the pedals. And I just want you to hear this building drinks bass because it's so huge. It amplifies treble, but drinks bass. So I just want you to hear the pedal foundation stops all together without the open wood number 1 then. And then if you could add both the 16-foot and 8-foot open woods to the pedal flue work. And you'll hear then the way this new stop amplifies the bass in this part of the building. you can hear that quite a significant difference in weight of tone between the two, and that matches the new diapason on the grate. And Andy's got one of the pipes, I think, here from the new open wood, one of the little ones at the top end of the stop. And can you tell us a bit about making this stop?
Yeah. When I was asked about doing this talk, I was asked to make any props I was going to bring significantly large so everyone could see. And my response was, my prop sits on the screen. But I've brought this pipe, and this is the top note of an octave wood on the pedal, and we always make a couple of extra pipes at the top when we make wooden stops. So this is the continuation of the octave wood. Here you get to hear just how huge it is in this space, but imagine this in the South Choir aisle. And Ben plays that with his feet. And these pipes are the largest scale open and octave wood that we would make. And it's nice to be able to put that back on the pedal for rather great moments.
And then also on the pedal, the biggest reed stop matching the chombers that you just heard is called Ophiclyde. And this stop was added in 1931. That's the one which the Dean paid for part of at the time. Not quite matching the 19th century Dean who paid for a whole organ. But this stop, the Ophiclyde, which appeared in 16/8 and 4-foot pitches, so very dramatic with a 4-foot 2, was considerably reduced in 1960 to become an ordinary style pedal trombone. It's still called Ophiclyde. And that's also been reinstated, it's the same pipes as part of this work. And it's also been completed down to 32-foot pitch. We know that Arthur Harrison had expressed the desire to do this when it was first made, but there wasn't then either the space, because the organ wasn't being redesigned, or the finance to do the extension down. And as part of the recent project, a group of individuals has enabled this 32-foot extension to happen. So Ben, I wonder if you could just play a few notes on the original trombones, the 32 and 16. The 32 has gone back into its original position in the North Choir aisle. It's painted a dark red colour. That's not all quite finished yet because there's some oak casing to go around the mechanisms down there, and also the steel supports on both sides of the organ in the aisles are going to be clad in oak too. So if you've seen those areas of the organ, it's not quite as it will eventually look. It won't be quite so near brutalist as it looks now. It'll look like oak rather than steel. So we're going to hear the pedal trombones and then the Ophiclyde, so you can hear the difference between them, and then adding the 8 and 4 successively, and then finally the 32-foot Ophiclyde. Just completes the underpinning of the organ for the most magnificent occasions. It's a luxury to have a second 32-foot reed, but it means that when we have an orchestra playing with the organ, or when we're playing with a large congregation, or indeed a specific kind of repertoire which needs that extra drive, then the stop's there. So the organ is fully complete with 2 32-foot open flue stops and 2 reeds. There isn't time, unlike the previous talk when we heard some of the quieter stops on the solo, but what I'm going to ask Ben to do now, before we just go to questions, and also for Andy to say anything else, is to do the build-up of the organ, starting in the quiet swell and then moving gradually through to the full organ, so you can hear that. And then when towards the end of the talk, when you're all going, we're going to have a final piece of organ music, which will give us a range of very quiet and beautiful sounds. It's very easy with a project like this to think it's all about noise, because an instrument like this is capable of making a big sound in this space, a very exciting and dramatic sound. But one of the great features of this organ is the poetic effects of its softer sounds and the way they sit in the acoustic. So the piece we'll hear at the end, and I'll tell you what it is in a moment, and we'll demonstrate that. But on the way to that, here is the gradual build-up through from the quietest swell stops through to the full grating swell with the smaller tuba stops also coupled through. Thank you, Ben.
Now I think we have a few moments for questions, and I have a colleague, I think, who's got a microphone. Would anybody like to start us off with a question? Down in the middle there, in the red jacket.
I'm a Minster guide and frequently pitch my unmelodious voice against your voicing. Please could you explain to me exactly what voicing is? And secondly, your beautiful organ is situated above the weakest point of the pulpitum. Why doesn't it shake it apart?
One for you, Andy.
Right, well, voicing, it's a dark art, people say. Voicing is, in its simplest form, is the scaling of the pipework, how it fits together. If you imagine an artist has a palette of paint in different colours, the organist has a different palette in musical colours, and a voicer has to marry the two sides of music and pipework together. So my job is to decide what scale, that's the diameter ratio to the length of the pipes. And then once all of that building blocks put in place, we have to listen to the organ in the building. So we spent many weeks here voicing the organ, and in unprecedented times with the Minster completely closed, and we had run of the place for 2 months. And it's all done by ear. And I had a keyboard which is wireless to the organ. I can put it anywhere in the building and listen to the organ in exactly where I want to listen. And it's a case of going through an organ, and if you imagine playing a scale up and down, it's about listening out for notes that are too loud or too soft, or not starting their speech correctly, or how the speech finishes, and making minute adjustments every time. So it's making sure that every pipe of every stop is even, speaks correctly, and how the pipes fit together musically as well. As for shaking the screen apart, you had some wonderful work done in the crypt preparing for the 32-foot double off the Clyde with all those big bolts and things holding the place together. It was a question that's regularly asked, the frequencies of the organ. The low frequencies aren't used very often. The upper frequencies have no detrimental effect on the building. They bounce off the hard surfaces. Low frequencies travel through glass. So as to whether the building's fallen down, the 32-foot pipes in the aisles have been there an awful lot longer than all of us, and the building's still standing, and I have no doubt it'll still be standing in another 100 years' time.
Have we got another question? We've got one in the middle there, Dana.
I'd like to ask, was there significant damage to the organ after the fire? Was that in the 80s, late 80s, the fire?
Perhaps that's one for you, Robert.
That's right, the organ did suffer from the damaging effects of the dust and smoke. Obviously, you can imagine the amount of intrusion there would be to put the fire out, and so the organ was in a pretty bad way in the 1980s going through, and as part of that work, things were kept going as best they could until the 1993 rebuild of the organ, when the mechanisms were renewed and everything was cleaned and brought back into being spick and span again. So that work was able to correct the damage done in the fire. There are a few things which were still visible from that fire. The nave console out here, which Ben's playing at the moment, still had some marks on it where water had inadvertently got onto it. And also the trombone pipes, which were in the south transept at that stage, had some marks on them as well. So it's that rather kind of scary little telltale of the fact that there had been this fire in the building.
And that brings me to a question we've had online. Andrew, could you comment on how you connect the console in the nave with the actual instrument that Ben is playing at the bottom here?
Yes, well, we've got two consoles here. We've got the screen console on the eastern side, and we've got the nave console here. And both of those consoles are physically identical in terms of their layout and all the furniture on the console, so it doesn't matter where you play. The piston system, which the organists can set their combinations for the different thumb pistons and toe pistons, is shared between the two consoles. But this console that Ben's sitting at is connected to the organ upstairs by fibre optic. So what happens is what the organist is doing with their fingers is turned into fibre optic signals by a computer, sends it up to the screen console, which unjumbles it and then sends the signals out to whichever set of pipes needs to play. And if Ben puts all the notes down in the right order, the computer will send them all out in the right order.
Do we have any more questions? So I think it's time to hear the organ again.
Before we do, I'd just like to say my personal thanks to Robert Woodland and Deborah, who of course have made a magnificent visual result to our organ. And Robert's told you how that all happened. And the visual result is more than matched by the tonal one. So my thanks to Andy Scott and Andrew Fiddis, who did the tonal finishing. And this is a very painstaking process where no time is spared to get things absolutely right. And it took 11 weeks of work to get this organ to this perfection that we have now. So I'd like to congratulate Andy and Andrew on that, but also their colleagues, the whole of the team at Harrison & Harrison, who of course all contributed to this massive result. And thank you for your support tonight, for coming to hear it and to support the demonstration. So to end, Ben's going to play Harmonie du Soir by Carl Gellert.
All that remains for me to say is thank you to our three speakers tonight, and especially to Ben as he sneaks off behind the altar. And have a safe journey home. Thank you for coming this evening.